I may need to apologise for the little trail that plays out towards the end of Nick's show when I suggested that a brief period as a landlord was the easiest money I've ever made. As I get back into the chair and notice my inbox, quite a few people are arguing, I think with some justification, that actually this is the easiest money I've ever made. It depends, doesn't it? On a good day, I suppose. But no, it's much. Mystery Hour's probably the easiest money I've ever made, and I can knock out a few board games off the back of it as well. So I don't know, but there is obviously a serious story. Well, is it a serious story? I don't know. I actually don't know. I think all of our brains have been so boiled by the last 14 years of misinformation and absolute absurdity in public life, particularly, of course, since 2016. When in 2016 the British public voted that black was white, that up was down, that left was right, that leaving the biggest single market on the planet would somehow make us more effective traders, and that leaving a rules-based institution would not somehow prevent us from enjoying the benefits of membership. When those things went out the window, I don't know whether something... Well, obviously, I think something broke. I wrote a whole book about it. That's not easy money, by the way. That is flipping heck. That's probably the hardest work I ever do is when I write a book, which I appreciate is a first world problem. But the return to normality has not happened as quickly as I might have hoped. And part of the reason for that is that journalism is still reeling from 8 years of absolute nonsense, the huge majority of which was spent cheerleading liars, spivs and charlatans. It's absolutely impossible to understand the problems that Britain faces without fully understanding the role that journalists played in promoting Brexit, Boris Johnson, and latterly Liz Truss. And then, of course, giving a free pass to hideous individuals, hideous politicians like Suella Braverman or Nadine Dorries, the Mark Françoises of this world. And so just because you've got now normal-ish, fallible people in government, you don't have sociopaths and weirdos, you don't have racist dog whistlers and bigots. You've got relatively normal people, some of whom are going to be idiots, some of whom are going to be hopefully quite good. But it's left the sensible parts of this profession confused. It's left them writing about Taylor Swift because they somehow think they should be. It's left them writing about issues that are not important at all, like what Keir Starmer chooses to hang on the walls of his home or his office in Downing Street. It's really weird. I'm not qualified enough to chronicle it. I was not a prominent or successful enough journalist prior to doing this job, which is a very specific sort of journalism. You need someone like Sir Harry Evans to have a look at it, the late Sir Harry Evans. You need someone who straddles media like a colossus. It's hard to think of many people in that category. I'd ask maybe Lionel Barber, former editor of the FT, whether he thinks that his old paper should be covering... Well, there's one story this week that I saw it on my feed. Even the Financial Times is covering this story, and it was as if that was a sign of decline. So like the deep end, but of course, those of us who enjoy swimming in the deep end also recognise the joys of a quick paddle in the shallow end and the steam room, not to mention the sauna. But that idea that we don't know what we're doing, and I don't know whether or not the brouhaha about whether or not Keir Starmer and his colleagues can define a working person is particularly serious. I certainly don't know whether the question of whether or not a landlord is a worker deserves all of the attention that it's getting, but it's getting it everywhere. I heard a Labour minister being asked this morning by Nick and also by presenters on other radio stations repeatedly, 5-6 times, is a landlord a worker? And I thought to myself, I think I know what the problem is here. I think I can see the problem that they've got themselves into. Once again, it's evidence that they need a kind of... If I say an Alistair Campbell figure, don't start texting me about the war in Iraq, all right? Because in terms of managing the relationship with the British media Alistair Campbell was very good at his job. I don't think they need an Alistair Campbell figure. That kind of mode of media management is probably out of date in the same way that the newspaper offices I used to work in with big shouting, ranting executives. That's past as well. Those days are over as well. But they need someone. In fact, they need the person I just described, don't they? They need that colossus, communications colossus, but somebody for whom the understanding of how the modern business works is actually more important than that ability I just alluded to. The ability to look at change and define what is serious or what is not. Because they don't have it. They've been completely blindsided by the violence with which enemies in the media have pursued them over nonsense. But I think what's shocked them most is the way in which people they presumed would be a bit more balanced or perhaps a bit more generous have also gone after them like a rat up a drain pipe over things like Keir Starmer's spectacles. You can imagine the conversation. Go, why are they coming for us when we haven't broken any rules? Harder than they came for the people who did break the rules. And they said, well, that's not fair. The Daily Mail and the Telegraph, the Express and the weird new TV stations, they might have treated us worse for not breaking rules than they treated their heroes and heroines for breaking the rules. But that's not what you get from the FT or the BBC or the Times. And then you sort of begin to think, well, maybe it is. Maybe that tail, if sort of shallow tabloid sensibilities are the tail, maybe the tail is now wagging the dog of the entire industry. It's not helped, of course, by people like a man called Robbie Gibb. I don't know if you've heard of him, being on the board of the BBC with responsibility, among other things, for impartiality. To give him his full title, he is Sir Robbie Gibb, a former director of communications for, wait for it, the Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May. When our friend and colleague Lewis Goodall was still at the BBC, Gibb took it upon himself to lecture Lewis on impartiality, while literally having on his letterhead the knighthood he'd received from a Conservative Prime Minister. Absolutely extraordinary state of affairs. But the latest chapter, the latest element would be this. Is a landlord a worker? Do you want to hear some clips of it? Do you want to hear James Murray, Labour politician, being asked repeatedly, 416 times, I believe he was asked, is a landlord a worker? And not being able to answer it. And I think I know why. It's because when I was a landlord, right, I've had two brief stints as a landlord. One when we moved to Norwich. Stop laughing to do a chat show. One when we moved to Norwich to try to become Alan Partridge. I'm not using the royal we. My wife came with me. So we're in Norwich and we rented out the flat that we had in London. And then a few years later, when we moved house without having sold our old house, but were so desperate to get into the new house that we gave the old house, we didn't give it, we put the old house in the hands of a housing association so that mortgage would be paid by the rent there and probably with a bit left over. And we were able to pay the mortgage on the new house. This, as you can tell, this was in the days when you didn't need massive deposits to buy houses. God, imagine listening to me say that if you're 25 at the moment. What do you mean you paid two? How did you get the deposit? I didn't. Our first flat, the flat that we rented out when we moved to Norwich, our first flat came with a 110% mortgage. One of the great things about getting married in the year 2000 is that you can always immediately calculate how long you've been married for. So 24 years ago, 25 years in next May, 24 years ago, I got a mortgage for 110% of the value of my property, of the property we were buying. And of course, a lot of people were getting similar deals on properties that they would then subsequently rent out, which is relevant to the conversation we're about to have. So this, I think, and let me give you a quick heads up on the possibility that I'm about to make an absolute fool of myself, because if it is as straightforward as I think it is, and the Labour Party has thus far managed to articulate it, then they've got a slightly bigger problem than the one they think they've got. But when I was a landlord, I was a worker. So if you'd said, is that landlord over there a worker? Someone would have said, yes, he works bloody hard. He does an hour a day on Channel 5 with Matthew Wright. That's very hard. And some days he records a chat show for Anglia Television later that evening. The poor man, he's like Sisyphus. He's like Hercules. Could you imagine anybody? But the point was, I was working. The money I got paid for messing around on the telly with Matthew was earned money. It was in return for my labour. I would turn up at the studio, chat a bit, and come home with a metaphorical cheque or a metaphorical pay packet, right? The money that my tenants back in Westbourne Park were paying to stay in the flat, and of course we were paying rent to a landlord in Norwich, the money, that was not earned. That income was not earned. So if you say, is that landlord a worker? The answer is yes and no. Which is why, I think is why perhaps politicians can't answer it. Yes and no. Yes, you are a worker, but no, the landlording bit of your income is not earned income. And the Inland Revenue tells you that. That's why it's taxed differently from the money that you earn in return for your blood, sweat and tears. The idea, and the more I think about this, the madder it becomes, the idea that you should pay more tax on the money that you get as a reward for already having money, as in for a return on your investment, you should definitely get to keep most of it. But the idea that you should pay more tax on the money that you earn for the fruits of your labour, a higher percentage on the money that you earn by doing work than on the money that you receive as a reward for having made a successful investment is absolutely incredible to me. And it's a relatively recent realisation. That's how I know that I've still got a few more years in me on this particular clock, because I still sometimes sit there staring at something that's been in front of us forever, and lo and behold, I get a new insight. I have a penny drop moment. I feel something sort of forming inside me that frankly should have formed years ago. Of course, the money I receive as a dividend on my shares or as rent on my property is not earned in the sense that the money I receive for bringing joy into your life at 10 o'clock every weekday morning, for bringing joy into 1.5 million people's lives every week. The money I receive for that, yeah, you heard me correctly. Actually, the figures came out yesterday. The money I receive for that is earned. So landlords are not workers when they are landlording, but they are workers when they're not. And then it gets even more complicated. Well, sorry, that's the simple bit. Then it does get complicated because Julian is in Denmark, and I think he does work for his money, despite the fact that most of his income, if not all of it, is from being a landlord. I have 7 properties. They were all derelict when I bought them and cost under £30,000. I rebuilt them myself and repair and maintain them myself. It's more than a full-time job. Perhaps you would like to swap jobs and then tell me it's the easiest money that you've ever made. But I don't describe you as a landlord. I describe you as a property developer and a property manager. So the landlording bit of your income should be taxed differently, if you like, from the money you pay yourself as the CEO of the company that develops and manages the properties. Does that sound naive? Does that sound difficult? Does that sound like a cop-out? If you buy a plot of land and build a house on it, you're working. If you buy a rundown property and do it up, you're working. But if you buy a property with people in it and just carry on taking the money in rent into your bank account, you're not working. So we need to work out where the line is. We need to work out where employment becomes relevant to investment returns. But what we certainly don't need to do, look, unless I'm missing something huge, I mean, this is Victorian. This is the rhetoric of mill owners and master sweeps. The people asking me to feel sorry for landlords if they're asked to pay a little bit more tax on their income derived from already being wealthy enough to be a landlord, or to pay more capital gains tax on the profits they make simply for having owned a property for a long time. I find that absolutely extraordinary. These are the people that would send your kids back up chimneys in a heartbeat. Won't somebody feel for the landlords? Cry me a river, honestly. And I can speak from experience. I've done it. Easiest money I've ever made in my life. And then, of course, in the UK over the course of the last 30 years, for every year that you are a landlord, you're not only getting someone else to pay the mortgage for you, but of course you're watching the value of the property tick up so that when you do sell it, you make a profit for doing nothing twice. You make money for doing nothing because someone else is paying to live there, and then you make money for doing nothing because it's gone up in value while they were paying you for doing nothing to live there. So what a bizarre business Britain is becoming. What are the questions? Should we feel sorry for landlords? 0345 6060 973. Do landlords deserve to pay less on the money they receive in return for being wealthy than you do on the money you receive in return for your blood, sweat and tears? 0345 6060 973. Do you think I've got it right? Do you think it is that simple? I mean, why have Labour got themselves into such a mess over this? Well, I'll tell you why. They should never have used the words working people. We won't raise taxes on working people. They should or if they were going to use the words working people, they should simply have said, we won't raise taxes on the earnings of working people. We won't raise taxes on the earned income of working people, because the income you get for owning stuff, that's not earned. Although I'm going to call it the Julian dilemma. The Julian in Denmark dilemma has a sort of agreeably alliterative ring to it, because I don't think he is in the category that I'm describing now, but it may well be that the law or the taxation system doesn't currently recognise that. So have I got this right? 0345 6060 973. Who the hell can realistically argue that the average landlord is a worker? And the best proof of that is the fact that they've got jobs as well. So the average buy-to-let landlord has got, 1, 2, 3 properties and a full-time job or a pension because they've retired. But they still think that is it's not working.